In the beginning, we've just passed through Black History Month, and I had called Dr. Van Sertima to see if he was available during the month of February. It turned out that he wasn't. But he did say he was free in March, and I felt that a presentation by him would be as good any time during the year. And we really shouldn't keep history confined to 1 month anyway. The simpleness in all of this is that he has a great deal to say. I've read some of his works, and they help reinstitute in my own head some of the things that I have thought, forgot about, but I think that in reading what he has written has helped improve my own outlook on life. And it turns out that good friends of mine traveled with Dr. Van Sertima to Mexico. And it was actually through them that I read some of his works. And I've asked a person to introduce Dr. Van Sertima, who comes to us from the Houston School, Mrs. Elsie Irwin, who is a teacher at the Houston School and traveled one summer along with Ted Irwin, her husband, who is a teacher at Pierce. And as I said, I'm going to ask Mrs. Irwin to introduce Dr. Van Sertima and tell us just a little bit about her experiences and perhaps how and why we can use what he has to tell us. Mrs. Irwin.
Thank you, Dr. Hankinson. I really don't know whether I can convey to you the feelings that I have about Dr. Van Sertima and what he has done for my thinking. About 10 years ago, I saw him on television, and he was saying something that I'd never heard, and I really wanted to find out more about it. So I began to, after about several years, I was able to hear him in seminar. And then I began to subscribe to his books. And it really opened up my mind and my thinking and improved my way of thinking about things that I have considered to be facts. And I thought it has now spilled over into my teaching because I look at the things that I teach the children and think about how long I held certain facts in my mind from my childhood. And here I am at this age, which I'm not going to give away. And here I'm at this age, just getting over. He was honored for his work in this field by being.
This article is based on a book which I published in 1977. They came before Columbus, African Presence in Ancient America. I am not the first person to suggest that Africans came to America before Columbus. Columbus was the first person to suggest it. He actually says this in the journal to his second voyage. Columbus says in his journal that natives from Hispaniola, as it was then called, which is Haiti and Santo Domingo area, came to him and told him that black people had come from the south and southeast in large boats, trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus may not have believed this, but what he did do was important. Columbus sent back to Spain on a mail boat 2 samples of these gold-tipped metal spears. The Spanish metal workers studied these spears, and they said that they were identical, not just similar, identical with spears then being forged in African Guinea. They went to the trouble of showing why it was identical. They said it had the identical ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys as spears then being forged in African Guinea. So I want you to note, first of all, Columbus actually heard the natives saying this. Secondly, the metallurgists confirmed this. Thirdly, a linguist from Harvard in the 1920s pointed out that these spears were being called guanin by the Native Americans in that area, and that it comes from guani, which is the word for these types of spears in West Africa. Fourthly, botanists studying the Cape Verde Islands discovered that Portuguese who had entered West Africa as early as 1450, about half a century before Columbus, took a cotton from West Africa into the Cape Verde Islands in 1462, 30 years before Columbus, which they thought to be an African cotton. When it was examined by botanists, it was found to be Gossypium hirsutum var. Punchtatum, which is not African. In other words, Africans had brought over into Africa an American brand of cotton. A brand of cotton, a type of cotton, a variety of cotton that is only found in the Caribbean and in parts of South America. And furthermore, the Portuguese noted, after Columbus returned from his first voyage and his ships were blown into Lisbon, Portugal, the Portuguese pointed out to him that they were aware of Africans leaving in large boats from the Cape Verde Islands and going far to the west with merchandise. So we have linguistic evidence, metallurgical evidence, botanical evidence, documents and statements of the Portuguese, statements of Columbus himself, statements of the Native Americans, and furthermore, every major explorer who came to America in the time of Columbus found blacks who were not in the slave period. Vasco Núñez de Balboa noted in 1513 that he found blacks among the Native Americans at Quaracoa, which is in the Isthmus of Darien, now Panama. Lopez de Gomara noted blacks in the Yucatan. Peter Martyr, the first historian of America, noted that blacks had been found in America in areas where there was no slave trade, and he thought that these were Ethiopian pirates who had been washed ashore, that they had been washed ashore in the Americas. The word Ethiopia at that time in Ethiopian was being generally referred to blacks. And you have also Fray Gregorio Garcia, who noted blacks of Cartagena, Colombia. He said, these were the first blacks we have found in the Indies. Now why I point to this, although this is not what I shall be speaking about this evening, I shall be speaking of a much, much earlier and far more significant visit by Africans. But the reason why I bring this up first is because I want you to be aware of the fact that even the late period, the period with which we appear to be so familiar, is a period where deliberate omissions have been made, because these things have been noted in various languages. In 1903, John Boyd Thatcher published a trilogy, 2,114 pages, in which he discussed and quoted all the journals and papers of Columbus in about 6 or 7 languages. And yet this has not come down to us. Few of us are aware of these facts. European history cannot be treated in the same way as African and American history. Europe has had the advantage because of its conquests. It has had the advantage of what I call an archival continuity. That is, you have libraries which have remained fairly intact in spite of a few burnings of books. Libraries have remained fairly intact. Libraries in America and in Africa have been almost totally destroyed. In America, for example, Bishop Lander told, he was a Catholic bishop who insisted that everything that the Americans had written should be burned. These were his orders: burn them all. They are works of the devil. As a result of that, we only have about half a dozen documents in America that are native to the Americans. We have few things like the Codices, the Codex Truana, the Codex Dresden, the Codex Madrid, the Codex Natal, a few books like that, Titulo Coyoi, the Populva, the Bible of the Quiche Maya, but we have very little surviving in American documents. The same thing is true in Africa. We have 3 massive destruction of African documents. We have the destruction and sack of the Library of Alexandria, where 500,000 documents were destroyed, and these were documents that were like libraries. Each document was a library. Today, and since the 15th century when we had the printing press, if you destroy a document, it's quite meaningless because there are 1 million more. If you destroyed a document in early times, you were destroying centuries. You have massive destruction of documents in Africa. In spite of that destruction, we have discovered the earliest mathematical books in the world, and the various medical books are African. There is absolutely no doubt about that now. It has been established beyond the shadow of a doubt. It was established in 1962 by an American team that even before the first Egyptian dynasty, there was a black dynasty in the Middle East, which would really be called the Nile Valley, dated 3,300 years before Christ, and that this dynasty precedes the first Egyptian dynasty by at least 2 centuries, and that 12 black kings reigned in the Middle East before the Africans started to move up into Egypt. They have shown that the first major writing system, there were other writing systems, but the first major writing system which appears in the Nile Valley or the so-called Middle East appears first among the Africans. In fact, what we thought were Egyptian hieroglyphs are not Egyptian in origin. An American team under Keith Steele and Bruce Williams discovered a kingdom, a black dynasty, a black pharaonic civilization to be exact, at a place called Kustal in Nubia on the edge of the Sudan 200 years before Egypt, in which all the elements, every major element, writing system, the gods, Horus, etc., the falcon god Horus, the palace facades and settings, and all the marvelous paintings, the pharaonic costumes, all these have been found in an earlier kingdom, earlier than Egypt, and it has been established that Egypt is culturally African. The classical Egyptian dynasties are culturally African. Not all Egyptian dynasties are African. You have, for example, dynasties that are invader dynasties. You have the Hyksos who attack around 1660 BC, and for 150 years you have Asiatics on the throne of Egypt. You have the Ptolemaic dynasties where Greeks and Romans have invaded. The Greeks invade around 320 BC under Alexander. The Romans invade just before and after Christ under the Caesars. Those are not African dynasties. But the classical dynasties, the early dynasties which created the pyramids, mummification, the extraordinary astronomy and medicine and mathematics of ancient Egypt have now been established by recent archaeology to be fundamentally African. Even the Egyptian language, which was thought to be Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic, is Afro-nothing, it is African. That has now been established. The recent work being done in archaeology is astonishing. It is extraordinary that it is only very few books in the world today which are being published that circulate this new information. I have attempted, since completing They Came Before Columbus, I have attempted every year to bring out 2 books, which are not just my books, I edit them, but are collected from the work being done all over the world, the work being done in the field of archaeology and anthropology, which establishes the new discoveries in African civilization. I say this before I go into They Came Before Columbus because it is necessary for you to have a totally different vision of the African. 90%, perhaps more than 90%, I would go so far as to say 95% of the anthropologies and the histories of Africa have absolutely nothing to do with the major or mainstream African. Most of us have been studying primitive Africans, Africans on the edge or periphery of the civilizations. I know this only too well because I spent 14 years in the bush. I spent the first 14 years in my life in the jungle. I never saw a city until I was 14. And I'm not talking about the African bush. There is no African bush in the world that comes close to mine. My jungle is twice as large as any jungle in Africa. It is in South America, it's the rainforest of South America, it's the jungle you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's not the little African jungle. Africa has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. Let me repeat that because that's a United Nations survey. Africa has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. By that is meant that if you can take 2 Europes and put it into Africa, which you can, there is more woodland and forest in the 2 Europes, which is comparable with the African land space than there is in Africa itself. The reason why we get this impression or vision of African jungle is because most anthropologists love to go in the bush to study primitives. They have a love affair with the primitive. I know this only too well. I was educated at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University in England. I had 4 professors. I was going to the only school in the world, I understand, which has more professors than teachers. I was the only person in the British world at that time who was doing anthropology and Bantu linguistics. I had 4 professors. I had won a special scholarship to London. I had 4 professors, 1 student. If I was sick and I didn't come to class, there was no class. That has advantages, but it also has disadvantages. If you don't go and if you don't prepare your homework, there's also no class, because you have to meet the professor face to face, and your ignorance is very naked. But one of the things I noticed and filled me with enormous anguish is that every one of my professors was a world authority on some little insignificant, irrelevant tribe, Booga-Boogas and Looga-Boogas. They were not interested in anything very complex and serious. Where blacks were concerned, where Asians were concerned, where Native Americans were concerned, they were not interested in mainstream Americans or mainstream Asiatics or mainstream Africans. Their only interests were in primitives. This is what has led to tremendous distortion of knowledge in the world. I have lived not only among the primitives in South America, I have lived among primitives in Europe, and I'm not talking about the cities. I have lived in Western and Eastern Europe. I spent a year behind Iron Curtain. I have been in parts of Eastern Europe where they have never seen a black man in all history. And I have passed through villages where I have found as many as 20 Europeans using 1 bathroom. Nobody writes about that because it would be unfair and untrue. You cannot judge the complexity and the genius of the European by looking at the backyards of Europe. You don't go to the primitives or the peripheral European in order to study classical European civilization. Yet we have taken for granted that in order to study Africans, you go to the worst and the most backward. So that you have millions of books in African that have absolutely nothing to do with Africa. Nothing to do with what Africans achieved, nothing to do with what they actually did in terms of civilization. Hence, in the 4 years I was at London University, never once did I ever learn anything about African civilization. And I was doing the best degree in the world in African studies. When I came out of there, I could tell you everything about primitives. But when it came to civilization, I had to start my own school. I have now produced 12 major volumes, which are now being translated at long last into German, Japanese, Russian, French, etc., which creates a totally different vision of what the African was involved in. And that comes from my own life, knowing how absurd it is for me in a jungle, 3/4 African and 1/4 Makusi Indian from the South American tribe, to get a glimpse of what was happening at the heartland of American civilization. Being in the jungle doesn't give you the faintest idea of what goes on in the heartland of civilization. So you cannot extrapolate from primitive studies what goes on in Africa. That is the reason why it became impossible for people until recently to take my work seriously, because one had not only to write, to present new facts, one had to create a different vision, a different way of thinking. And many people say, well, okay, but this happened hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. That has nothing to do with it. Because time is relative. What happens 1,000 years ago or 10 minutes ago occupies the same room in consciousness. We are ruled by what we think happened in the past. We are determined by this. All our prejudices, all our assumptions, all our concepts, all our perceptions are determined by what we think happened in the human family in the past. Therefore, what happened 1,000 years ago, 10 minutes ago, what we think happened in the past determines what we are, how we behave, how we conceive of other people, how other people conceive of themselves. The world remains static as long as that thinking continues as it was. Fixed ways of thinking, feeling, seeing, fixed ways of conceiving of people and of ourselves remain fixed until a different vision of the past occurs. Hence, the past is not dead. The past is part of the living present. Unless that past changes, or rather, unless the conception of the past changes, we cannot go any further. We cannot enter into any serious research. Within the last 7 years, for example, there have been a dozen major discoveries in Africa brought about by American teams who began to think differently about Africa. The Americans discovered Tarseti, which precedes the Egyptian dynasties by 2 centuries. An American team discovered Africans had started to domesticate cattle 15,000 years ago, when before other teams had said it was that pastoral farming, etc., was developed, the nation brought to Africa. We find it now thousands of years before in Africa. They've discovered, American teams have discovered not just tools, but tool-making tools in Africa. They've now discovered only 2 weeks ago that Africans were using crystal tools. American teams have discovered Africans were smelting steel 1,500 years ago in a blast furnace that achieved temperatures of 1,850 degrees centigrade, which is 200 degrees centigrade higher than any blast furnace in the world. American teams discovered that Africans had developed an astronomical observatory 300 years before Christ in Kenya. The Americans discovered that Africans had invented a method of dealing with, they had developed a method of dealing with the cesarean in the 1870s, at the time when the cesarean was still experimental and extremely dangerous, even fatal in Europe, that they had developed aspirin before us, that they were using tetracycline as an antibiotic before us. All of these things have been discovered in the last 10 years. Only a year and a half ago, one of our satellites spinning around this planet sent down radar beams into Africa 16 feet below the African Earth and discovered the traces of ancient rivers running from the Sahara towards the Nile Valley. I said that in my book 10 years ago. The satellite discovered it a year and a half ago. I was able to say this, and a few anthropologists were able to say this, on the basis of deducting from a body of things, migratory evidence, the skeletal evidence, the movement of scripts, the dispersal of linguistic networks, all of these things that led us to make those statements with confidence. Now the machines from space established they are true. Just as 2 years ago, the Einstein orbiting satellite and the American Earth satellite discovered that the Africans were dead correct when they said that there was something contracting and expanding within the region of a white dwarf. There was a supernova expanding and contracting within the region of an imploded star, which is Sirius B, which the Africans had tracked down and shown the orbit of 7 centuries ago. We know nothing about this. None of this has yet begun to circulate in schools. This book, Blacks in Science, which was published in 1983, goes into African astronomy, African aeronautics, experimental aeronautics, African metallurgy, African medicine, African scripts, etc. But all of these things are locked away from us because there is only 2 interests in Africa: in the past, in primitives; in the present, in problems. Anything else is irrelevant to us. We are not interested, as we become interested in Greece and Rome, the classical civilizations of Europe. We are not interested in the classical civilizations of Africa. What we are dealing with in Africa is what existed after the Holocaust. We are dealing with a shattered world, a world which is just beginning to pull itself together, a world which has lost a great deal, but a world which establishes, because of the new archaeological discovery, that it is by no means due to any biological inferiority, but due to the recent centuries of extreme social and historical conditions that you have a broken and shattered world. It is very important that we should understand this, because last month in Nature, a dozen eminent scientists in the world, including one African scientist, established through a new method, molecular biology, established through a new method, that the founding family of the world, the last man, the final man, the modern man is Africa. And that all peoples are variations of that Africa. There is no polygenesis. Man was not born in different places at different times. Man was born in Africa, and he wasn't merely born in Africa, which has already been established years ago by Leakey. It has now been established within the last year or two that man was not merely born in Africa, but that the first European, the first man to enter Europe, last man, final man, modern man is African. The first man to enter Asia is an African. And that what you have, therefore, is one human family. You do not have different types evolving ahead of other types. The European type comes about as a result of ecological differences as the Asian type, but it is not a distinctive type or more advanced type than the other type, because the DNA is now established, they are all one type, that you do not have fundamental differences between races. Racial differences are superficial. They appear to be large to us because our society has made it so. Let me now go on to my subject. It is important before one enters any subject of this nature to rinse people's brains out with ice water. Because there is so much false information, such a vast amount of misinformation that clouds our vision, that it is not accidental, that it is only within the last decade that we have been able to make any serious discoveries in Africa at all. Discoveries cannot be made simply by having better machines or by working harder. New discoveries are only made by having a different kind of eye. A different kind of eye has begun to open, and we've begun to see entirely new things. This story starts, as I say, with Columbus, but it starts the most important, the most significant visit of Africans to America occurred much, much earlier than Columbus. It occurred, in fact, before Christ. And I want to show you slides now which establish this. In 1858, some Mexican peasants were wandering about in a village called Tres Zapotes, and I wish, could you throw the lights at home? That incredible racket at the back, is it possible to stop it?
Malfunction that
I want you to bear clearly in mind when I speak of Mexico, I'm not talking simply about Central America. Mexico is not the shrunken Mexico today. Mexico included parts of Texas, Colorado, parts of California, going right up to La Plata in Canada. Mexico, therefore, before Christ, was truly the center of American civilization. Do not confuse it, therefore, and say this is all about something that happened in Central America. It also happened in the so-called United States. The United States is a very recent invention. It's just a few hundred years old. I'm talking about events that occurred much, much earlier. Here you have, in that sort of basin, you see there where the diamond points are, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo. That is known as the Olmec heartland. Olmec are the first major civilization in America. When I say civilization, I'm not talking about culture. There were cultures in America, we now believe, as a result of recent discoveries. There were cultures in America many, many thousands of years ago. The Bering Straits migration occurred during two ice ages, about 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, respectively, so that we have Americans in America many, many thousands of years ago. What I should speak of now is not something that occurred at the beginning of American civilization or at American culture. It's something that occurred at a critical juncture in American history. Okay? In this area, about 100 years ago, they discovered a stone head. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. This is a head that was discovered. They found one in 1858, but this was found in 1862. Now I want you to observe this head. Here you have perhaps an attempt by natives to evoke and capture the features of a face that are strange to them, so that there is an element of exaggeration here, but there is no question that you are dealing with an attempt to capture as realistically as possible in monoliths, in huge colossal pieces of stone, a certain face. Next. Now this is the front of the face, this is the side of the face. And now look at this, the third slide. This is the side, this is the back of the head. Now nowhere in the world except in Egypt and in Nubia do you have a 7-braided hairstyle. This thing has 7 braids. Now this is found in 1862. Although several of these stone heads have been found, it has been argued that these heads, although they appear to have broad noses and full lips, that there is a reason for that. Some people suggested that they're really babies with puffed faces. Some people have suggested they're really leopards. They have these funny mouths because they're the snarling lips of leopards. Some people have suggested that these are throwbacks. All sorts of peculiar explanations. The latest explanation came in the Science Digest. The Science Digest ran a story on me, which is a very good story, by one of the leading writers of the New York Times, Boyce Rendsburger, which showed that my case was far more scientific and far backed by more facts than any establishment case. And he asked the establishment expert, Michael Coe, how do you account for the broadness of features, the broad nose and the full lips of these figures? And Michael Coe said, the reason why they have broad noses and full lips is because the tools were blunt. They couldn't make them any sharper. Now what blunt tools would create a 7-braided hairstyle, which is never found in America before or since? This is, whatever you may say that there may be some Asians with full lips and broad noses, but none of them have this hairstyle. The natives went to great trouble, this is more than 100 years ago, to delineate, to define clearly what they were seeing. Now, I'm not the first to start talking about this. The Mexicans are the first. Nicolas Leon, Riva Palacio, Orozco Vera, all of these, Jose Melgar, all of these Mexican writers wrote of Africans in America before Columbus in short articles. What my major contribution has been is that I have put together all the evidence that has existed over the past few centuries, all the evidence that establishes this on a scientific basis. But this head, you can see clearly, has both the geography, the facial geography, as well as the hair style of an African type. Next. Next. Now this shows you the enormity of the head. They're 6 to 9 feet high. They have found about 14 of them. When I had finished my book, there were only 11. They've now found 14 or 15 last year. They found another one. This is Dr. Matthew Sterling's widow. In fact, it was she who gave me a copy of the photograph of the braids, because that had not been released before. Even when I wrote They Came Before Columbus, nobody had released that photograph. It had been sitting silently in the archives of the Smithsonian for half 100 years. Dr. Matthew Sterling was sent out as the head of the expedition to Tres Zapotes and later to La Venta, and this is his widow. And she's sitting there so that you could have a sense of the enormity of these heads in relation to people. Next. Another head. This is very well preserved, and I want to note something on this head. This head has a helmet. It is a copper helmet that was used. You see that flap falling along, and you have the circle here plugged. They're copper and leather helmets that were used by the Egypto-Nubian armies in this period. And you want to know what you mean by this period. How could they date it? Stone cannot be dated because it is not organic. However, fortunately, at La Venta, the center of this civilization, they made 9 charcoal samples of wooden ceremonial platform which 4 of these heads were stuck, and it was established that those heads were inextricably linked with the wood. The wood could be dated, and it gave a carbon reading of 814 plus or minus 134 BC. That is between 948 and 680 years before Christ. So these heads have been dated. That is a very, very significant period, not only in the dawn of a major civilization in America, but in the twilight of the Bronze Age in Egypto-Nubian world and the Mediterranean world, because that is a period in which a war is going on between the Asiatics and the Africans. The Asiatics are charging down the Mediterranean. They have smashed the Hittite Empire. They have made vassals of the Phoenicians, who are friendly with the blacks. They have partially defeated the blacks in the north of Egypt and driven most of them back into the arms of the south. They have captured the Jews. The blacks entered the battlefield of Jerusalem to protect the Jews in 701 BC when Taharka, the black general who was later to become the king of Egypt and Nubia, entered the battlefield as the Jews under Hezekiah were wavering as to whether they should face the Asiatic army or retreat, and the blacks saved the day. The Asiatic army is defeated and the Jews are saved because they have an alliance at that time with the Egypto-Nubians. This is the type of war helmet that was being used in that period. You can find it with Tanis in the Egyptian Delta, not only on Egypto-Nubian type heads with the broad noses and the full lips, but also on some foreign mercenary troops. Next. Here you will have now a panorama of some of these stone heads. Next. You can see clearly the features as attempt to represent them. These are from 10 to 38 tons. Some of them are 10 tons in weight. Some of them weigh as much as 38 tons. They are 6 to 9 feet high. Next. 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 One of the extraordinary things that I discovered last year, no, not last year, in 1984, I discovered that there were markings. I jumped from the top of a tree onto one of the heads and discovered there were markings on the roof which nobody had photographed. Usually they're photographed like that, they're not photographed from above. But I discovered on the roof of the head markings, and then began looking on the roofs and discovered that all the roofs of the heads had markings. So now the Epigraphic Society has started to decipher the markings that show various connections and started to deciphering the markings on the roofs of the heads. Next. Next. This shows you the 3 main capitals, La Venta, Persepolis, San Lorenzo. Next. 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 This has recently been removed from Villa Hermosa, where it is on view. They said it's too delicate after it's been standing in the well for 3,000 years. Next. There it is again. Next. The rain gods. Next. This is a mock-up by Alexander von Moutonneau, who spent 40 years in Mexico dealing with terracottas. That start from the stone heads. There are terracottas, that is clay sculptures of Africans. In the middle here, these are stone heads. That is Taharka, the king of Egypt and Nubia at the time of this. And you see some of the American heads next. Now come the terracottas. The terracottas may not be as photographically realistic, some of them, but what is extraordinary about the terracottas is that you cannot claim the tools were blunt. Here is clay, which is easily worked. And here is an attempt to do 2 things which are not done in the clay, in the stone sculptures. An attempt to evoke, by the use of oxide dyes in the clay, an attempt to evoke the coloration of the skin. So that you find those heads that do not have this geography, this facial geography, do not have this type of skin. And you also have an attempt to evoke the close curl and coil of Africoid hair. So that you have an attempt now to capture the hair so that you can't say this is an Asiatic. Because even though there may be some Asiatics with broad noses and full lips, their hair is different. So you have a corroboration in the same sites, in the same historical period, in the same civilization, in the same sites, as I say, you find these heads. You find, in addition to the stone heads, you find these terracottas. Next. You have a range of them now. Next. These are the same being shown again to show the effort. I have held this in my hand. It's nearly 3,000 years old. You see the attempt to capture, as I said, is a very delicate process. Next. This is a woman from Xochipala also in the Olmec world. Next. Okay, I think one of the slides will fall down. In the meantime, let me point to the fact that in addition to the terracottas, they have found skeletal evidence. Professor Wierzinski of the University of Krakow has discovered that there are skulls and extended skeletal types in the graveyards of the Olmec at places like Tlatilco, Serra de las Misas, and Monte Alban, which further corroborates what is found in the stone heads and what is found in the terracotta. Professor Wierzinski notes that in the royal graves, a note, in the royal graves, not the graves of the common people, but in the royal graves, in the priest caste, among the Native American type, which is overwhelming, there is an Africoid type, distinct from, in terms of nasal index, in terms of the structure of the jaw, prognatism, in terms of the brow ridge, etc., and in cases where there's extended skeletal material in terms of the length of the limb. So that you have a distinct Africoid type which seems to have entered the population at this time. Now most people say yes, but even if you can find skeletal material or terracotta or stone heads, how on earth could Africans come to America? This is a very early period. Nobody had such boats. That is a complete falsehood. Because the Atlantic is far easier to cross. Listen to this closely because this is something that has been established very clearly. The Atlantic is far easier to cross than the Sahara. Far easier. The Atlantic has 3 advantages over the Sahara. The Atlantic is not a dead body of water as the Sahara is a dead body of sand. To cross the desert, there are no roads in the desert. There's hardly any food in the desert. The desert is a dead place. It does not move. The Atlantic moves. The Atlantic moves. It has 3 roads. There's a road off the Cape Verde that moves right into the Caribbean, South America, right into the Gulf of Mexico. There's a road off the Senegambia coast that moves right to South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. There's a road off Southern Africa that moves towards South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. Those are like marine conveyor belts. Anything caught off Africa, 100 miles off Africa, that gets into those currents has to come to America unless the fish gets it first. There is no question about that. There have been at least 120 experiments with small and large boats. Hans Lindemann has done it, and one of the most remarkable ones was done by Dr. Alain Bombard. Bombard set out with an African dugout, which no African will be mad enough to use in the Atlantic because Africans developed at least 7 types of ships on the Niger and a lot more on the Nile. But in an African dugout, the worst possible vessel that you could use in ancient times, he set out alone without a crew, without a sail, without an oar, without food or water, and made the journey hale and hearty in 52 days in less time than either Columbus or Vespucci. Let me repeat those facts. Bombard, Dr. Alain Bombard, took an African dugout, went into the currents of Africa, which I speak of, and made the journey over to America without a crew, without a sail, without food or water in less time than either Columbus or Vespucci. Europe is about 3,000 miles away from America. Africa is only 1,500 miles away from America. Not only is it closer, much, much closer, but you have no way out of coming to America once you are caught in a storm of Africa. I know this for a fact. Every August at springtime, on the shores of South America, where I lived and where I was born, parts of the forest, fruit, dead birds, anything that was afloat on the currents of Africa came floating into my beach. It's automatic. Alvarez Cabral in 1500, with a fleet of more than 7 ships, a fleet of 7 to 10 ships, all the ships were blown to South America. He just got into a storm, and in a few days he was in South America. He said he discovered Brazil. Brazil discovered him. He entered that current, and so he came. Thor Heyerdahl proved this to the world. Heyerdahl is the most famous to test this thesis. Heyerdahl got Africans to build a boat in 1969. The Africans looked at boats that had been used at least 1,000 years before Christ. I want you to note the time. The Africans looked at the drawings their ancestors had used 1,000 years before Christ of boats. They took a papyrus reed boat, which is used on the Niger, which is used on the Nile. The Baduma people on Lake Chad took this boat and crossed the Atlantic under the supervision of Thor Heyerdahl. The boat's rudders broke on the first day, which means they did not steer to America. The boat came by itself, driven by currents in 1969, and crossed from Africa to America, from Safi in North Africa, right into Barbados. So that it has been established the capacity to cross. The question arises, but why did they come and what did they do? Why did they come? They had no intention of coming. Nobody who came to America, whether it was Columbus or Cabral or any of these people, had any intention of coming here. Columbus struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India. That is why this place was called India. It wasn't called America. This was not called America. This was called India. That's why we still call the Americans Indians. And that's why we call the Caribbean the West Indies. This is what it was called at first. Columbus thought he was off India, and that is why this place is called the Indies. It was not called America. That was later. He thought he was in India. In fact, he went to a lot of trouble to prove he was in India. Columbus sent his notary, Fernando Pires de Luna, among the ships and got every man jack to sign a document that he was off the coast of Asia. And he threatened his men. He said, if later you were to say you were not in Asia, if you were an officer, you would be fined 500 maravedis, docked several months' salary. And if you were a common sailor, you would be given 100 lashes and have your tongue cut out. That is in the journals, that is in the notes, that is in the studies of Columbus. Nobody mentions this. Nobody mentions that on the 4th voyage, Columbus and his brother Bartholomew were arrested by Bobadilla and brought back like blacks to be tried in Spain because he had fooled the Spanish about his so-called discoveries and that he was attempting to keep the Spanish from entering South America while he allowed Vespucci, his best friend, to come into South America. Because Columbus never once set foot on the American continent, north or south. On Tuesday, August the 7th, 1498, 3 of his ships landed in South America. Men came off that ship. Columbus would not come off the boat. He's the great discoverer, would not come off his ship. He said he had arthritis. And a report came back that they found at the Almanzar handkerchiefs symmetrically woven with the same pattern and colors as handkerchiefs being woven in African Guinea. All that was reported. Do you know Columbus suppressed that report? We didn't hear about it for a few years. Columbus said South America was an island. did not go back and tell the Spanish that he had found the landmass in the south, and he himself did not come off the ship. Columbus, in fact, is the beginning. This is how you get the beginnings of the same kind of vision of the American as we have of the African. Because Columbus only wandered among the primitives of the Caribbean, like myself. He never entered the heartland of America. It was Cortez, the first European of the Columbus period, who talked about civilization in America. Cortez said, and I quote him, "When I saw their pyramids and their palaces and their temples and their floating gardens, the chinampas, the most advanced agricultural technique then in the world, and their aqueducts and their reservoirs and their zoos and their running baths." There were very few running baths then in Europe. He said, "I have not seen its like anywhere." They were not dealing with primitives. But when I grew up, when I came out of the jungle and saw movies for the first time, and I saw my cousins, the Native Americans, I was ashamed of them as much as I was ashamed of Africans at that time. Because all I was taught about them is that they had no bloody civilization. And when I looked on the screen, I saw it. Every day one was assaulted with it, the cowboy pictures. There is some ignorant Native American brushing on his little horse across, and there's the caravans, and there is John Wayne and Ronald Reagan picking them up from the caravans. These are the images that dominate our civilization. They're the same images of the Native American as of the African. And we cannot continue with those images because they're not of advantage to anyone, including the European. They are of no advantage because they have brought us to a tremendous blockage in history. Fixed ways of seeing, feeling, and thinking that affect everything. It not only affects research, it affects the capacity to think afresh, which is necessary for the survival of this civilization. This is serious. I have traveled all over the world. I have lived all over the world. The only continent I have not lived in a nation, I didn't need to live in Asia because 52% of my population is Asiatic. But I have lived in Russia, I have lived in Hungary, I speak Hungarian, I've lived in East Africa, I speak Swahili. I've lived in South America 24 years, I've lived in North America for 16. And one is very aware as one lives in the world and moves in the world, how critical it is that we should change our vision of what was and what is, because it will certainly determine what will be. We are on the threshold of something very serious. This isn't just a question of learning about what Africans did. I'm not confined to Africans. One learns afresh what has been done in the world and the relationship between races and the capacity of races, because the human family is in danger. It is in danger because it has become so locked in a struggle against itself, the parts of itself. It has become locked in that struggle because of an ignorance, a grave and serious ignorance and blindness about how those parts relate to each other and what they do and what they have the capacity to do. Ideas about biological inferiority spring from this. It springs from these historical falsehoods. It is only when these falsehoods are revealed, it is only when these falsehoods are shattered that we get the chance through a new kind of objective historical truth to recover and reconstruct ourselves as a human family. One of the most astonishing things, I'm sorry that the machine went off, because one of the things I wanted to show you is a map. When I brought out this map, the New York Times said it was a fake. 2 years ago they said it was valid. There is a map that shows the African coastline, just where the currents start. And it shows the South American coastline and the Gulf of Mexico swinging towards Florida, just where you have this landfall and the appearance of these figures. And this map was found in the Library of Alexandria, the Sack Library of Alexandria. And that map shows that somebody had drawn a map indicating the coastlines of African America before Columbus. It had the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates. No map until the 20th century was as correct in its latitude and longitudinal coordinates, and it could not have been drawn by Columbus or people. It was found in 1513. It could not be drawn by Columbus or people at that time because nobody in Europe could draw the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates until the 18th century. A special prize was given for that. Only the Egyptians and the Chinese knew how to do this, and the Chinese were not operating in the Atlantic. I remember in 1974, December the 4th, 1975 to be exact, I published on the op-ed page of the New York Times an article, Archaeology's Discovery of an African Presence in America. Well, that stunned a lot of people, including myself, because the New York Times gave 3/4 of a page to this discovery. And it was their most important page, the op-ed page. The odd thing, however, the New York Times tried to get back at me after a long fight, about 5 weeks, as to whether they should publish this or not. They decided to open the page to me. But then some people who had lost the battle because there was a faction in the New York Times about this, some people who were liberal said this thing needs to be exposed, it is very important. Others felt no, it shouldn't be. So they ran the subtitle Bad News for Columbus on the archaeology discovery in African presence in America. Then they ran a cartoon next to my article showing a naked American Indian woman, and there's an African man standing up in top coat and tails, their idea of civilization. And there is Columbus, poor fellow, with his hanging flowers, seemed to suggest poor Columbus came to woo this woman, but she'd already lost her virginity to the black. In other words, what they were suggesting is that what Van Sertima is saying is that before Columbus came to rape the poor American Indians, the blacks had already done it. So they tried, yet fortunately few people understood the complex symbolism, so they merely read the article. However, letters came in from all over the world. One of them came in from Soviet Russia. Academician Sanarov of one of the Soviet scientists in Asia wrote me to say they had been doing a lot of work on migrations to America, the Bering Strait migrations, which we all agree with, but they had also been dealing with Pacific migrations by Chinese and Japanese before Columbus. But they were very interested since they had never heard about the Atlantic migration. So a dialogue began. And in this dialogue, I asked the Russians if they would avail me of discoveries that had been made in return for work that I had done. Discoveries they had made in ancient Egypt, because NASA had allowed them after the Aswan Dam project to do a lot of archaeology in Egypt. Sadat kicked them out, because archaeology is used for all sorts of reasons, as you know. However, one of their scientists, they said, Bolosimo had discovered perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Egypt, indicating that the early Africans had telescopes. This is a solution to great mystery because we have found the Africans plotting an invisible star, Sirius B, 7 centuries ago. So that there seems to be evidence. Galileo had said so, that there were telescopes in Africa. Galileo, in fact, used the African water clock. Let me end by pointing to something that is very important. The ships Columbus and Vespucci used, almost all the instrumentation in those ships were non-European. One of the things that many of us are not aware of, and in this note I close, is that so-called Western civilization, its achievements, particularly its seminal developments, this generic science that is the foundation of Western civilization, is not European. It is a composite of world civilization, world contribution. The sails used by Columbus and Vespucci were Arab-Latin sails that Africans and Arabs had used in other oceans. The compass was not developed in Europe. The astrolabe was not developed in Europe. Those were major instrumentations on the ships. Even the guns were not developed in Europe. The Russians have recently shown an Arabic manuscript showing the Muslims using fire sticks, as they were called, for the first time in the invasion of India. This is long before fire sticks or guns were used against Africans and Americans. During the Moorish invasion, you have a movement of many things from Asia, from Africa, from the Arab world. This does not reduce European genius, because Europe had the enormous advantage, which it still enjoys today, of having seized the technological initiative after 1492. That is the very year, it's not only the year in which Columbus sailed, but it's also the year in which the last of the Moors, the Almohade, which is largely an African dynasty, was defeated in Spain. It is not an accident that Spain and Portugal were the first to come here into the Americas, because it was in Spain and Portugal that the Arab and African dynasties, the Almoravid, Almohade, and the early ones, the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties were established. For about 700 years, science coming out of China, out of Egypt, out of Greece, out of Persia, out of parts of Africa and the Arab world poured into Europe. So what you have as the basis for the Industrial Revolution, which is never mentioned, is not simply European genius, but a composite of world contributions, which was codified and which reached a point of explosion and expression in the European world because of the special advantages of that kind of invasion. An invasion which did not seek to destroy European civilization, which did not take the tongues from the Spanish or the Portuguese, which did not interfere with their civil institutions. All the Muslims insisted on was that they should have some say in the election of bishops. It was not the same kind of conquest that was to shatter the American world or the African world. So let us have an open mind about history, because it is not true that American history and African history has yet been written. It cannot be written in the same way as European history has been written. It cannot use the same methodology. To write they came before Columbus, I couldn't just go to libraries. I couldn't just go and say, look, this is what happened in Africa in the 10th century as you could go in Europe. I had to go into linguistics, into botany, in oceanography, in archaeology, in anthropology, in cultural history, in cartography, in serology, in every possible field, because it is like if an explosion had occurred in those worlds, and the fragments and pieces were all over, and one had to pull them together by going into the various disciplines where the various discoveries had been made. It is because of that explosion that we have to be extremely careful, that a very painstaking effort has to be made to recapture and to reconstruct world history. Thank you very much.
I guess there's nothing more to say but wow, because I think you got a sense of the kind of spirit and fervor that Dr. Van Sertima brings to his work. I'm impressed. And I'm wondering whether or not there are any questions that you might want to ask him.
I would be most happy to entertain questions. Yes.
Could you clarify for me one more time the point that you made about civilization emanating from Africa? That is the evidence that was found. Was it the skeletal evidence?
Oh yeah, there are three main pieces of evidence. There are really four. I've only dealt with the physical evidence. There are three main pieces of physical evidence. There are about 14 stone heads, 6 to 9 feet high, weighing from 10 to 40 tons, which have been found in the capitals of the Olmec civilization. At Tresapotes, San Lorenzo, and La Venta, the capital. Okay. 4 of these heads were stuck in a wooden ceremonial platform at the Venta, which gave a carbon reading. The wood gave a carbon reading of 814 plus or minus 134 BC. That is 948 to 680 BC. The second piece of evidence corroborating this is evidence of terracotta, that is clay sculptures of African type, African type hair, African type scarification at times, African type faces found in the same capitals. Not just the capitals, La Venta, San Lorenzo, and Tresapotes, but also other outlying areas of the Olmec world. They have found many of these terracottas, distinct from Native American terracottas. Although the Americans did not have photography, they were as obsessed as we are today with the camera. They were obsessed with representing themselves. So they have about 2.5 million pieces surviving showing the Native American type, so that we can make a distinction between what the Native American looked like at that time with other types that are not native to America. The third piece of physical evidence is the skeletal or skull evidence that Professor Brzezinski unearthed. It could not be found in the swampy areas where the stone heads were found because the corrosive humidity of the soil destroyed skeletal material. But in the dry areas where this civilization had other major outposts like Tlatilco, Serra de las Misas, and Monte Alban, they were able to find skulls and skeletal material. But in addition to that, there's also stylistic material. I haven't had a chance to deal with that because that would take a great deal of time. I can only refer you to the book and to the sequel. I'm now doing a sequel, and I'm also head of a symposium which comes out in December of this year called Africans in Early America. I am doing a book along with Alexander von Wutenau in Mexico, Rafik Jairasboy in England, Malcolm Bradley, and Neil Steele at Epigrapha and Gloriopharm, so that there will be a major new work which contains all of the recent evidence, but largely stylistic, showing the identities between certain elements in Olmec civilization, not just general parallels, because general parallels exist among peoples far apart who made no contact, but very specific types of cultural parallels in addition to those things that are native to place. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yes.
Do you think we should still continue teaching history, American history, to our children as it was passed down to us? Or should we give them a different version?
But what you have to do, because this is what happens in transitions, that you have to have supplemental history. You see, it's very difficult to rip off all the history books. That happened to some extent because in most history books now they don't say this Columbus discovered America. They point out the Vikings were here before Columbus, 1000 AD. The Vikings were here after the Africoid presence in Olmec, BC. So you can have a supplementary history. You don't have to destroy completely, but you have to get rid of certain mythology. 1492 still remains a significant date because 1492 changed the relationships between continents. While Columbus was not the first to come here, his myth about this being the land of gold, his ability to fool many people that he had rediscovered the lands of Marco Polo and that this was a golden world, a world where they could find lots of treasure, caused massive movement of Europeans in this area. It also brought about the conquest of America and the conquest of Africa, as a result of which 1492 is a watershed year. It is the beginning of new relationships between continents. It is the beginning of the twilight of American and African civilization. He has to be placed in a different context. 1492 still remains a critical year, as I say, a turning point. But he has to be placed in a totally different context. It has to be shown that what he did, while it may have been of great advantage to Europe, in the sense of bringing masses of people in this direction, that it was not necessarily of great advantage to the world. Okay, that there are certain damages that were done. I've been able to convince many people in the United Nations of this. This is one of the things I had to sabotage, because 1992 was to be a great year celebrating Columbus. I got behind some of the third world countries and convinced them that there's nothing to celebrate. Okay, so that there are certain things like that we have to be very clear about, because you cannot go on insulting people. You cannot go on insulting people with myths and falsehoods. There are certain things that are critical, because most people seem to think history begins in 1492. Even blacks think that. Many blacks think that history begins with slavery, and before slavery they were in the jungle. Okay, this is one of the most frightening things, and many whites also perpetuate this kind of myth. Some of them because they don't know any better, and some of them deliberately do this. Because some of my professors, for example, when I would confront them and says, but this could not possibly be true, I place myself in grave danger because your grades are affected. So it is absolutely necessary that a certain number of new texts have got to be written, that they have to be supplemented. You have to point out to kids that while it is true Columbus sailed to America in 1492, he didn't discover it. I never even claimed Africans discover. How could you discover a place where there were millions of people? You know, you can't walk into a lake and say you discover Lake Limpopo. What happened to the people living on the lake? No, I don't use those insulting terms. It's important. What he did is important because while he was a villain in many respects, nevertheless, what happened at that time did change the history of the world. So it is still of some significance. But one has to point out what was the nature of that journey. Because it is important to understand it's not only Africans came here, other people came here before Columbus too. The Vikings did. They weren't as early as the early Africans. But the Vikings did not make any impact, any significant cultural impact on America. The Africans did. You see, I'm only giving you half of the story. To deal with the cultural impact will take at least another hour. Because you can't sum up 10 years of study in 1 hour. I mean, a vast amount of work has been done. Impact on scripts, impact on paper made from wool pulp, impact on certain rituals like opening the mouth of the dead ceremony, impact on certain technologies like the Middle Americans, for example, use the same mathematics, with the exception of the zero. They use the same mathematical measurements that Egyptians use, which is very strange. Then they have 4 calendars, and one of those 4 calendars is identical with Egyptian. And you can't find it anywhere in the world. Even when they have their burials, they have the cardinal points with the same colors as the Egyptian. And when you go to China and Japan, as I've discussed with the Russians, when you go to China and Japan, where you've had later migrations or even Bering Strait migrations, the cardinal points do not have the same colors as you find among the Olmec, who have identical colors for the north, south, east, and west as Egypto-Nubian in the Mediterranean. So that you have some extraordinary things that you cannot easily explain away anymore. Every year we are finding new things that make us aware that we have got to rewrite some of the major history, and the history of America has to be rewritten in parts. In the meantime, since you can't get rid of the history books, you just have to supplement them. You just have to say, well, and in addition to that, so and so and so is the case. And some things that are blatantly untrue, you have to correct it. You have to make a statement about it. Okay. Thank you very much.